It's a pleasure to introduce our first speaker today. Jill Escher is the president of the National Council on Severe Autism. Jill Escher.
Thanks, Hugo. I really appreciate it. Thanks for inviting me, and it's good to see so many friends here on this call, and also to hear a little bit about the goings on at VOR. I was glad to see some of the things that you were working on from an advocacy point of view, and I know there's a lot of overlap with what NCSA is doing, and I think after this meeting, probably Hugo and I will have some interesting discussions about how we can work together. So my talk today is really a kind of big picture talk, not really in the weeds, not very nuts and bolts. It's about sort of broad themes. And I realize that I'm preaching to the choir here, and that the themes that I'm presenting here will not come as a shock to any of you. I think that you've seen it all, as have we. And I'm calling this the 7 deadly sins of autism. I looked for an image of the 7 deadly sins, but actually the most accurate one I could find was from SpongeBob. And those are the original 7 deadly sins, but I'm talking about different deadly sins today. So just a little bit about me. I got into the world of developmental disability really not by choice. I had been a lawyer and was working in the federal courts and kind of had envisioned for myself a very different trajectory than what actually occurred. But along the way, I had 2 children with severe nonverbal autism. Johnny is now 23 and Sophie is 16. Johnny is definitely my more severe child. He requires around-the-clock care and has abundant difficult behaviors, challenging behaviors that make him hard to fit, as I'm sure is true with most of your children, hard to fit in our current system. Sophie is, as I said, she's 16 and she still lives with us. And unlike Johnny, she's very mellow and mild and congenial and easygoing. And although she has nonverbal autism, does not present with severe behaviors. I also have a 25-year-old son who lives in Texas and is not diagnosed with autism. So why do I call the things I'm about to talk about, quote unquote, deadly sins? I'm going to talk about circumstances, themes, constructs, that I think prevent us from taking decisive and rational action. And they have real negative human consequences that result in blunting of progress in science and in clinical treatment, that decrease the scope of options for disabled adults, that result in underinvestment in our infrastructure. And of course, as you guys know better than anyone, the workforce crisis, a poor quality of life, including physical and emotional suffering, isolation, neglect, abandonment, abuse, and impoverishment, and ultimately shortened lifespans and death. So I do believe that what I'm talking about are in fact deadly sins. They don't cause death immediately, but they do increase the risk for all of these things over time. And why must we address these forthcoming sins? Well, for autism and developmental disability care, and this is particularly true in the case of autism, parents are shouldering the vast majority of the work. In California, more than 90% of all people with autism live with their parents, and the parents do most of the heavy lifting to help the kids. And this is a trend, of course, across the country. But all of us will grow old. We become infirm, and then we die. It's not like this is a possibility. It's not like, oh, this might happen. This will happen. I mean, there are only 2 things that we can be sure of, which are death and taxes, and death is definitely one of them. And it is coming for all of us autism parents. And by and large, our charges will outlive us. So we have an inevitable wave hitting the beach, and we're kind of choosing to look away. Because what will happen when we die, really nobody knows. There's no roadmap, there's no game plan. We have a system in place. We do have um, a very tattered safety net in place, but it is woefully inadequate to serve the number of people that we need, that the number of people who will need support. And it's a growing national crisis, but there's no sense of urgency about it, in my opinion. In fact, there's a sort of counterinsurgency against what I think is a needed sense of urgency. So let's go into our sins, our new our new 7 deadly sins. The first sin that I see is a watering down of the concept of autism. Autism has historically been a serious developmental disability involving clear and significant impairments in social functioning, in language, and in repetitive behaviors or other, behaviors, what they call stereotypies, kind of obsessions, repeats. I mean, these are things that not everybody with intellectual disability have, but it distinguishes autism, I think, from the rest of IDD, that people are tend to be stuck in a loop and tend to be very rigid and often have a need for sameness and can't get off a certain topic or can't get off, a certain behavior. And, but these requirements in the construct of diagnostics have been watered down somewhat over time. And we're at the point now that autism is now being called a fairly benign condition, not a disorder. It's a natural difference. It's part of human diversity. It's a different way of thinking. It's a different way of being in the world, but it doesn't necessarily involve any pathology, any impairment. And this is a romanticized ideological approach to ASD, and kind of at the forefront of this movement is the neurodiversity movement, but that's not the only place where it's coming from. A lot of these proponents cite stigma as a reason to sort of neuter and reduce the language around autism. But stigma is absolutely like the least of the worries for our population. We care about addressing real acute needs like reducing aggression and self-injury, improving daily living skills, finding long-term care. And their MO is what I call catastrophizing, right? Like as if we call autism a disorder, if we talk about impairments, if we talk about pathology, if we talk about how devastating autism can be, it will somehow result like, like draw an arrow, a direct line from like these words and concepts to eugenics and malfeasance, marginalization, forced institutionalization. So, without any evidence for this, there's this idea floating out there that if we tell it like it is, if we tell the truth about autism, it will result in these terrible things downstream. Whereas we see it very differently. If we tell the truth about autism, it will improve the chances that we get the help we need, which is the case with every other, psychiatric and medical condition. I don't know why autism has been singled out, right, as being like the only psychiatric/medical condition, that needs to be treated differently. So I believe that we can have full acceptance, right, of our children, which is what we do want, but we can also use accurate language to describe their realities and their levels of functioning. It's hard to think of a disorder more overwhelming than severe autism. And this is from one of our board members, Dr. Lee Wachtell, who's the head of a neurobehavioral unit, at Kennedy Krieger Institute in Baltimore, Maryland. And she discusses some of the behaviors, that she sees clinically, but that we see obviously in our population all the time. Self-injurious behaviors like head banging, biting, pulling out your hair, skin picking, face slapping, eye poking. I mean, I don't have to read them all. Aggression, hitting, kicking, scratching, biting, pinching, choking. I've been, the victim of many of these myself. Disruption, throwing objects, which is my son's favorite thing to do, breaking and ripping items. Oh, also my son's favorite thing to do, knocking over furniture or destroying furniture is the case in our house. Screaming, spitting, breaking windows, pica, ingestion of inedible objects. My daughter, even though she has very few behaviors, she ended up in the emergency room at Stanford on New Year's Day because she had ingested a toy that had blocked her small intestine, and she had a full intestinal blockage that would have killed her. So I don't look upon autism as some sort of benign difference. This was a deadly, a near fatal, right, circumstance for my daughter. Fortunately, they performed surgery and extracted the offending toy, and she's fine now. But it was very scary. And these things, all of these problematic behaviors are incredibly stressful and often horrific, nightmarish for families. They woefully reduce quality of life and definitely reduce the amount of opportunities that are available for those who suffer from them. But nevertheless, we're stuck in this place where we're supposed to talk about autism as a non-disorder. We're supposed to talk about autism as a benign, difference, a diversity, a neurodivergence. I mean, it's insane. It's absolutely ludicrous, preposterous beyond imagination. But this is actually something that we face, and sadly, we see this narrative, this watering down autism narrative, gaining traction in many places, including in some scientific, quote unquote, scientific and medical journals. This was, I think, published, last year in Pediatrics. It was written by some autism self-advocates. And this particular paper called for the removal of traditional terms and more medical terms about autism and replacing them with sort of these softer concepts. You can see we don't talk about it as a disorder, right? We don't talk about deficits. We don't talk about even symptoms, right? They want to remove the word symptom. They want to remove things like words like problem or red flag or risk. Like, yes, we want to talk about risks for autism. Everyone wants to know what risks for autism are because we want to reduce it, but we're not allowed, apparently, according to these people, to talk about risks. We can't talk about functioning labels. We can't talk about prevention. I mean, it's absolutely amazing that people actually think this way. It's doubly amazing that something like this finds a place as a commentary in a quote unquote respected journal like Pediatrics. But here we are, and we really need to fight back against this. We see it at the NIH as well, at the IACC. I don't know how many of you follow the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee. Their chair, who's the head of the National Institute of Mental Health, Josh Gordon, at their most recent meeting seemed to indicate approval for neutering language at the IACC after coming under some pressure from self-advocates who are on the committee. Even other places at the NIH, their Genome Institute has accused itself of eugenics, right, for using medical type language. I mean, it's insane, but it's almost like this hysteria and a kind of mob mentality, and people are succumbing to this mob mentality. So, euphemistic platitudes, I believe, represent a real danger to our loved ones. They result in really stupid ideas like everyone can live in the community. But what does it mean? It means defunding your program. Ideas like not adhering to, if every single person can't adhere to a norm, such as competitive employment, right? That's a civil rights violation, right? Well, it's a stupid idea, but it results in the elimination of disability jobs. Autism is a difference, it's neurodivergence. Well, it seems like that is resulting in lack of interest in finding causes of autism and looking into prevention. So these euphemisms offer comforting fictions in the short term, but they inherently cancel suffering in reality, and they divorce us from the tangible hardships that our loved ones face and our families face. And I believe it's our moral duty. Our moral duty is not to the subgroup of people who feel so fragile, right, that they're so sensitive that they can't handle, words like disorder and risk. Our duty is to help the vulnerable to recognize their predicament as it really exists and to alleviate their suffering. And this mission requires clarity and accuracy. All right, let's move on to sin number 2. This is one that I'm very passionate about. And I'm sure you guys are all aware of it. And raise your hand if you're not and you need some clarification here. But there's been widespread denial of what has been an absolutely meteoric increase in autism cases, not just here in California where I am, not just across the country, but really globally, at least in the developed countries that have been doing counting. We really find ourselves in unprecedented territory when it comes to autism and DD policy because the population has changed so dramatically, both quantitatively and qualitatively. Now, if you look back in time, in 1943, autism really barely existed. The leading pediatric psychiatrist of the day was Leo Kanner, and he first described autism in 1943. And he described it as something that was unprecedented, something that had never been seen before. He later in his career said he only saw about 150 cases of it, and that included cases from around the world, right? And he and his colleagues definitely would have recognized kids like mine as autistic, and the other 150,000 now in the California DDS system. There are 150 classic autism cases just in like one part of my school district, right? There's so much autism. It has absolutely flooded our system. And it's insane to think that people like Leo Kanner, who were brilliant scientists and researchers and clinicians who had seen thousands of patients, right, over their lives. It's insane to say that, oh, all of them missed this. The first epidemiological study on ASD reported minuscule prevalence. And we actually here in the States, that was in the UK, here in the States, another study, it was called the Collaborative Perinatal Project, based on successive births over, I think it was about 7 years, found a similarly very minuscule prevalence. They said even after that study, the researchers went in to say, well, even if we kind of looked at autism as a broader spectrum, that percentage would have gone up to 0.066. But now it's approximately 2.3% of children. If you talk to clinicians from the olden days, even people who used to run institutions, they will tell you it was extremely rare to have seen children or adults with these characteristics, regardless of label. And now what we're seeing in our systems is an absolute crush of autism cases, across all systems. Okay, so this shows the most recent CDC numbers, 1 in 44 or 2.3% of all 8-year-old children. And this data is actually from 4 years ago. And so what we're probably seeing now is even higher rates. Here we see that the rates do vary somewhat by the region in which the CDC conducted its monitoring. My state of California had an exceptionally high 4% of 8-year-olds. This was in San Diego County. And it's not exactly clear why we see these variations. Some say it's ascertainment. Other people say it's actually kind of different biological factors or immigration related factors. At this point, we really don't know. But this is a very scary trend that we're seeing rates as high as 4% in the CDC estimates. Now, if you go north to Canada, we see very, very, very similar curve, similar trends. I won't go over that in detail. In New Jersey, quite alarmingly, we are seeing these, exact same trends as we see nationally, a little bit higher. You see that they're higher than in New Jersey than nationally. But what's really frightening to me is that we are seeing in more recent studies of regions in New Jersey, even higher levels, closer to 5 to 7% of 8-year-olds in large metropolitan counties in New Jersey. These are recently published studies, and it includes a finding of 12% of all 8-year-old boys in the Toms River School District. I mean, these numbers are absolutely jaw-dropping and amazing. And you might say, well, Jill, you just talked about how autism's been watered down. Maybe that this includes, kids who just are quirky, just are different, and just have benign personality differences. But when you talk to the researchers who actually conduct this surveillance, they assure you that these people meet criteria for the diagnosis of autism, the disorder of autism, and they have significant deviations from normal development, that are persistent and result in manifest impairment. And they bolster those findings by saying that extremely high percentage, I can't remember, it was something like in the 80 to 90% range, I believe, of these children have special education needs. So they're not just different, they're people who can't fully adopt to a standard curriculum. Then if we go across the pond, if we go to Northern Ireland, we're seeing really extreme increases in autism, most recently towards 5% of all school children. California, that's in blue here, in our DDS system, as of the 2014 birth year, we were getting close to 1.5% of all children born in California ending up in the DDS system as autism cases. Whereas if you look back to the 1980s, it was like 0.04%. So a dramatic, humongous increase. We're seeing 50-fold increases in the caseloads in autism over a 35-year span, 50-fold increase in caseloads. So this is not subtle. This is not subtle. If we look at the special ed numbers, I got this data from the LA Unified School District, which is the biggest school district in our state. And you can see that autism in special ed has increased astronomically over 20 years. And if we look statewide, actually, the data is very similar. Over this time, I do want to note that the overall enrollment in LA Unified has been shrinking and is projected to shrink even more. But as overall enrollment declines, we're seeing dramatic increases in autism. If we look at service systems such as SSI, a recent report found that there's been a dramatic increase. It doesn't look like much right down here in the red circle, but it's grown I believe it was threefold over 10 years in terms of claims. And we know that to get SSI, it's a pretty high standard. You don't just waltz in and say, I have a disability, I can't work. It's hard to get SSI. You have to be pretty darn disabled. And we have seen a big increase in that, what I would call an objective standard. So the implications for this autism tsunami, I think, are massive. One study is found that autism will reach approximately 3% of the GDP in terms of the burden on our national economy. I actually think that's probably a low estimate, but I think that should be sounding alarm bells across the country, and it really hasn't, which is shocking. So one thing I just want to note as a sort of side note here, that as ASD rates have, by all accounts, skyrocketed, we need a new insurance mentality around what's now a very common disability. I think it's sort of crazy that in the insurance world, we insure our health, our home, our car, we insure ourselves for liability, we have life insurance, we have travel insurance, right? But probably one of the biggest costs that families face now is the cost of having a child with autism. I mean, that is really the biggest risk people are facing now. 30 years ago, it was off the radar. It wasn't something people were thinking about because it wasn't happening. But now it is. But we don't think about it because our insurance for autism has largely been from the public sector, and that's good. We need Medicaid should be the number one form of quote unquote insurance for long-term care, ongoing care for people with autism. But it's really an incomplete paradigm, and Medicaid was really set up for a population that was much smaller and much different in terms of what they needed. So the costs of autism are stupendously huge. And we need a much grander sense about how we share this relatively new risk. I call it an insurance mentality. I don't necessarily mean private insurance, but we need to really wrap our heads around what's happening with this new generation of children. All right, sin number 3, repetitive dead end research. I know that VOR is not a research oriented um, um, organization, but it's something that I'm very interested in. I'm very involved in boosting innovative research in the autism world. Um, so we really still don't understand what's causing the vast majority of autism cases. We know it's not vaccines. We know it's not genetics in the classic sense, but new mutations, or what are called de novo mutations, explain about 10 to 15% of cases, which is something. But the rest of the cases, we still don't have a genetic cause for. It's common to assert that autism is genetic because it's very heritable. People speculate that it's due to what's called common variants that occur commonly in the population. There's actually no proof of that, but the speculation has sort of morphed into a kind of dogma. Prenatal exposures can explain some of the risk, and so can adverse perinatal events like preterm birth. But those explain probably maybe 10% of cases. There hasn't been a huge amount of study on it. We do see a lot of babies who are born now who would not have been born in earlier decades because of advances in medical care. And that's a good thing. I mean, I'm glad that we're saving babies, and I'm glad that people, with extreme medical conditions are able to live and living longer lives. But that is adding partially, right, to the autism caseload. But by and large, when it comes to research, we're doubling down on failed strategies and not addressing new ideas, even as the autism even as autism prevalence continues to rise. So I'm in the new hypothesis business. It's another hat that I wear. I have a fund that funds innovative research into causation of autism. You guys are not interested in biology, and so I'm not going to go into it. But I do want to say my interest is in something called the genetic toxicology of autism, which is basically looking at what might be happening on a toxicological level to our sperm and egg cells, and how that affects the development of our offspring. In short, autism might not just be genetic, it might also be something called epigenetic. There might be something that's changing the way the genes work in this newer generation of children. And I write about this quite frequently in scientific publications. Here are just 2 papers that I've written. If you are a geek and you want more, you can just go into like Google Scholar or PubMed, type in my name and autism, and the papers will pop up. But I'm not going to belabor the issue, except to say that our shortcomings in research is definitely one of our deadly sins. Sin number 4, this is getting more on VOR territory. Delusions of inclusion. Now, I think inclusion is a great ideal where it's feasible and desired. Another hat that I wear is I'm a community-based landlord for low-income housing for adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. I have 13 tenants right now who have IDD. Most of them have autism. Some are rather high functioning. Some are definitely not high functioning at all and require 24/7 care. Many of my tenants, not all of them, many of them had been living in institutions but had been moved into community care. And I would say in most cases, not all cases, it's been fairly successful. And it can work if it's properly funded. My tenants who moved out of institutions received highly favorable care packages, unlike any care packages that are available to like your standard DDS client. And I think that's one reason that they were successful. They were more highly staffed. Their staff got paid more than standard rates. But inclusion, it can work. And I've been happy, to serve as a landlord to people who need this housing. But it definitely doesn't always work. And this is a scene that is unfortunately not uncommon in severe autism houses. And a lot of these people absolutely have no way of living, quote unquote, included, quote unquote, in the community. They need specialized housing and specialized services. So again, preaching to the choir here, problems abound. Some of them involve the misconstruction of Olmsted as a mandate, which it definitely is not, but you guys already know that. I won't go into the details. And a lot of them are based on ideological crusades, which are divorced from reality. Inclusion is neither feasible nor desired in many cases of severe autism. A lot of these cases, they can't find housing in the community. No one will give them housing, um, aside from it being completely unaffordable. And if they're at extreme high risk from eviction for eviction. Why? Well, a lot of them scream and have loud vocalizations that disturb other tenants, and those other tenants, oops, I'm sorry, how do I go back? Have the right to quiet enjoyment of their premises. It's right there in their rental contracts. Property destruction that no landlord will stand for. Aggression and other behaviors. Often they have needs for amenities like open space, swings, or sensory equipment, faces, security, gates, on-site medical provision, need for staff space. A lot of them end up, when they do get housing in the community, being extremely isolated, which is something I know a lot of your loved ones have experienced. There's no real community at all in many of these cases. I had a tenant who lived in one unit who was severely disabled. And behind him was another unit, and I had residents there, tenants there who were typically, very typical residents. They didn't have disabilities. And I was chatting with them one day, and I said to them, "Hey, how is Joe doing?" Referring to the guy who lived in the unit in front of them. And they'd been living there for, I think, about 2 years. And they said, "Oh, we've never seen him." Right? These are people who are supposed to, like, live in the community with like normal people. They're almost never seen sometimes, and they live like prisoners in their units. And who fixes the constant damage, right? That's actually not something that's solved in the HCBS system at all. Who monitors for safety? Definitely not something that's seen in the unlicensed HCBS system. So as you guys know, we need the full continuum of care, and the inclusion delusion is very destructive. It is definitely one of the 7 deadly sins of autism. Sin number 5 is related to sin number 4, and it's something I called a phenomenon of autism housing for rich people only, which really is our de facto US policy. No one says it. No one from the government will say, our policy is to provide autism housing for rich people only, but that's exactly what we see happening now. And I wrote about this recently on our blog at NCSA. So you can go to our website and look it up if you want some details about what I mean by this. But just basically, I'm here in the San Francisco Bay Area, and so we have it worse than most parts of the country. But this is happening around the country. But housing costs are soaring. Everybody knows SSI payments, which might be like $900 a month, can't come close to covering actual housing costs, not to mention, utilities, repair, other things. There's little to no priority at the Department of Housing and Urban Development for the most severe cases. You basically get in line with everybody else for a Section 8 voucher, no matter how disabled you are. Often or not often, but sometimes there are special Section 8 preferences for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. But the programs that I have seen, by and large, are restricted to those exiting institutions. In California, that's like 0.05% of our IDD population. So on paper, it looks like, oh, HUD has these priorities, but in reality, the vouchers go unclaimed. I mean, I've really seen this happening, and I think it's a crime. Section 8 vouchers, again, I'm kind of repeating myself here. They can be very useful. They often, especially in the Bay Area, which is very expensive, can't give you access to a unit that's adequate for that individual or that's in a safe neighborhood. And again, what about the need for the amenities that people with autism and IDD often need? The larger yards, the room for staff. What about property damage? Oftentimes, you can't get that. I'm not going to talk about ICFs because that's VOR's sort of specialty. except to say that, the ICF numbers decline even as the need for them skyrockets. So the people who didn't have means, who had no financial means, but could access ICFs as part of their safety net, no longer have access to those ICFs. And they're thrown into the HCBS system where that doesn't buy them housing, right? That's what I mean. Housing for, autism housing for rich people only. The ACL has turned its back on severe autism and focuses on the high functioning. And many local resources, like, if you're looking for low income housing for, people with disabilities, a lot of those resources have been really diverted to the issues of mentally ill and the addicted homeless and the working poor homeless as well. Also, to an extent, veteran homeless. So, it kind of left us out of the picture of low income housing. We also need more family oriented solutions such as legacy homes and accessory dwelling units. I don't have time to talk about those, unfortunately. Moving on to SIN number 6, restricting settings for those for IDD. Again, preaching to the choir here, you guys have worked on the HCBS settings rule. And while it has softened, I believe it remains a substantial threat to the creation of operationally and financially viable options, owing to the heightened scrutiny provision of quote unquote settings that might isolate. And it's insane. It's just this totally amorphous kind of blob of a rule that threatens congregate settings, but doesn't really tell you how or why. So it has the effect, a chilling effect on the creation of new options. This rule, I think, is super paternalistic. It's about really what the government wants and not what's person-centered, and it's disconnected from the reality of operations and real estate development. As I said, it's instilled a culture of fear because it really relies on this arbitrary litmus test around size and character of buildings. And the disability activist zeal for one size fits all settings, I believe, is really a terrible sin, because as the population grows and has such a diversity of needs, we need to be focusing on continuum of care, which is obviously what VOR is really all about. And we need to do it at rates that attract the needed help. So this goes to SIN 6.1, which is my frustration with, like, I can't believe that we spent so many years, right, in the disability world talking about freaking settings when instead we should have been really focusing on how much we need the right people around those with IDD. It really is a sin to be talking about, well, you need to have, like, so many bedrooms, or not too many bedrooms, not too many bathrooms. Somebody needs their own key. They need to put their own pictures on the wall. Like, who cares? Like, all this stuff that nobody cares about. It seemed to occupy 99% of people's mental space when we should have been talking about the need for people, right? We're talking about a massive influx of young adults with autism who need people around them, and they often need people around them 24/7. This is a picture of my son Johnny with his caretaker Paul, one of his caretakers. Johnny, like a lot of people with his level of disability, need probably 5 to 7 staff. 5 to 7 staff. I want you to think about that number. When we're talking about, 1 in 44 people with autism, right? And maybe half of those people will need very intensive care. Okay, 1 in 88, let's just say. Think about that 1 in 88 needing 5 to 7 staff, right, in their adult lives. It's unbelievable how huge the need for staffing is going to be. And we're already, of course, reeling from a horrific staffing crisis. We really need to get our brains around what we need to do to radically expand staff that's available to help these young adults. Especially, it will become a more exponential problem as parents ail and pass away. Sin 7, undermining parental family care and authority. We've seen, of course, attacks on guardianship in many forms. We at NCSA definitely believe that guardianship is an essential legal protection for those who are incapable of managing their own affairs. It's been attacked as oppressive, right? We parents and guardians slash conservators are often accused of, violating the civil rights of our loved ones. But of course, nothing could be further from the truth. We serve as guardians and conservators because we seek to improve the happiness, health, quality of life, and rights of the people with severe cognitive and functional disabilities. And it's not like guardians just do their own thing. I don't know all 50 states' laws, but the ones that I've seen, guardians must consider the preferences of their charges. They must consider and act in their best interests. The discretion of guardians are constrained, and they're supervised by the court. They often have to make reports to the court or the court investigator. It's not like guardians exist in this weird world where we just want to control our children. Sometimes it's portrayed that way. Now, supported decision making, I believe, is a bonkers and dangerous idea for most people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. I'm not saying that these people shouldn't be able to make their own decisions where they can and where they have the ability to do so. I believe they should, but it should be done in the constraints, in a frame where they have legal protections of guardianship, where someone can always say no, right? Where a caring and informed caregiver can say no if necessary, right? If somebody with IDD wants to run off and marry some person they met on the internet, really, there should be somebody there to say no. General representation of those with ID, apart from guardianship, has been a real issue and a real undermining of parental care and authority. Having a seat at the table for those who represent those with severe autism has been a real challenge. We've seen, for example, the IACC that I talked about before, the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee at the NIH, being almost completely stacked with autism self-advocates and almost no voice for those who represent those with severe autism. And this is an unfortunate trend that we see all over the disability advocacy sphere. We need to have more representation for our loved ones. We are not represented by the high functioning self-advocates whose needs are very, very different from our children's. So reviewing the 7 deadly sins, the watering down of autism, the denial of the autism explosion, repetitive dead-end research that's going to result in no prevention and no clinical treatments, inclusion delusions, autism housing for rich people only, restricted settings, and what I'd say is the kind of backside of it, which is the lack of focus on staff. Sin number 7, undermining parental authority. So is there absolution from the sins? And I just want to say, as you guys already know, it's very hard. I think the world has catastrophe fatigue and really doesn't want to hear anymore about the autism explosion. We have a lot of other catastrophes going on: climate change, COVID, Russia and Ukraine, inflation, gun violence, homelessness, China, North Korea, nuclear bombs, political rifts, you name it. There are a lot of things that are eclipsing what is a very real, I think, public health disaster, in our country. Our kids are also astonishingly expensive. Nobody wants to hear about anything that costs a lot of money. Parents and advocates are exhausted and overwhelmed and often just can't, come to the table and talk about their needs and counteract what's happening among kind of common beltway advocacy groups. We have what I believe is a very dysfunctional Congress. I don't want to talk about that too much, but I think it can be difficult to find the right people to be our advocates in Congress. And then, of course, fighting for all these issues across 50 states is very daunting. But at NCSA, we're moving into more of an advocacy role. We have been building our community for the past couple years. We've been focusing on cultural zeitgeist, which I consider soft advocacy, which is telling our stories, telling our realities. We've done that through website, blog, newsletter, social media, some direct advocacy with decision makers and policymakers. But where we're now headed is to what we call our national grassroots network, which we've been building over the past couple months and continue to build. We've had many hundreds of people sign up for this. And we would like to see this national grassroots network partner with our allies like VOR, like Together for Choice, but other ones as well, to have a stronger voice on the policy changes that need to be made, in Medicaid, in HUD, at labor. There are many places where we really need to be heard more loudly. And so that's where we're going now. I didn't know you had a lobbyist. It was nice to see her speak, and that's somebody I think we should be connecting with as well. And that's it. I don't know how I did on time. Went a little longer than I wanted. If you want to contact me about anything, this is my email address. So thank you so much for having me. And thanks for your attention to a long, rambling presentation.
Thank you, Jill. We have time for a question, I think.
Can I say
Rita
something?
Winkler, Rita Winkler.
I just have to tell you, the best line ever is their divorce from reality. I just had 2 phone calls during your presentation from families in Illinois wanting services. And since March of 2020, when the pandemic started, our state center, Murray Center, we have admitted 40 individuals. Almost all of them are between 20 and 30, all of them but 2 with severe autism. And they're pretending it doesn't exist. And I'm like, where are these people going to go if we were not here? All of our state centers in Illinois now are pretty much full. And if we can get staff, we're opening up all these closed units because they're everywhere. So thank you so much. And I just want to share this eventually with the people in Illinois who still live in a dream world, which is mainly the Arc of Illinois. And they tell us if we only would put these people in the community and hang around with the right people, they, quote, would become normal. One of them told me that last year, and I'm like, all right. But anyway, thank you very much. Thank you.
It really is a mind-boggling dream world, mind-boggling disconnect from reality.
Yes, thank you.